we inhabit pyramidal structures. Those are hierarchies of, well, they're hierarchies. I think in our society those are mostly hierarchies of competence. We inhabit hierarchical structures on a plane that's defined by our understanding, surrounded by what we do not comprehend. And that's the universal human world. And that hierarchy itself is a cooperative structure that enables us to live with a certain amount of peace and productivity together, and also to establish a value system with whatever is at the pinnacle of the hierarchy regarded as whatever's most valuable. Now, think about what happens in The Lion King. It's a voyage into what's most valuable. It's an examination of what's most valuable. Now, the Old Kingdom is threatened by Scar. Scar is the evil king of the evil brother of the king. The king is the entity that inhabits the pinnacle of the pyramid. The king always has an evil brother, and you know that as well. And the reason for that is that there's no hierarchy that's so pristine that it isn't threatened by corruption. And Scar is presented as a resentful intellect. And that's a very common trope as well. That's the evil scientist idea. It's not the only the evil scientist idea. It's the mad scientist. It's the evil genius. God, how many movies with a mythological substrate have come out in the last 20 years that prominently feature an evil genius? It's like there's dozens of them. There's an inexhaustible hunger for that representation. I mean, in the last Avenger movie, you had Thanatos, right, who's basically the spirit of death, who's an evil genius who thinks that mass extinction is the answer to the population problem of, let's say, the world. Something to think about very seriously. Well, the reason for that is that the state is always threatened by malevolence. Always. The hierarchy can always become corrupt and tyrannical. And that the forces of malevolence, let's say, that are conspiring behind the scenes, tend to tilt every hierarchy towards tyranny. And the proper attitude to take towards that universal truth is to stay in the light and keep your damn eyes open. And so, well, what happens in The Lion King is that the evil brother overthrows the rightful king. And that, again, is an unbelievably common idea. You see that idea echo throughout the mythological landscape for centuries. And the reason for that is it happens all the time. That's what happened in Nazi Germany. That's what's happened in most of the tyrannical societies of the world. And most societies in the world are tyrannical. There's always the possibility that the hierarchies that we live in will become corrupt and counterproductive. And there's multiple reasons for that. But they're summed up in the malevolence of the arrogant intellect. It's something like that. That's a very common idea. That's the character of Milton's Satan, by the way, because he's the ultimate in arrogant intellect. Milton's Satan is the figure who believes that his knowledge is sufficient to do without the transcendent, to do without the idea that there's something beyond or that there's still something to learn. All I know is all that I need to know, which is exactly the belief of the fundamental tyrant. The evil brother of the king kills the king. Simba loses his father. Well, that's another common idea, because everyone loses their father in some sense. People grow up and become cynical as teenagers. And the reason they become cynical as teenagers is because they see that the corruption of the state is sufficient to undermine their confidence in the benevolence of the state. And they get cynical prematurely, because what the hell do you know when you're a teenager? But you're encouraged in your cynicism frequently in our culture, which is a very bad idea. Now, I mean, even though it is the case that the structure is always threatened by malevolence, let's say, and human weakness. Simba ends up fatherless and lost and alienated from his kingdom, just like King Arthur. It's the same story. The rightful king is often dissociated from his kingdom and forced to occupy a domain that's outside the kingdom. And that's what happens to Simba. He loses his father. And what happens? He adopts the lifestyle of an impulsive adolescent. That's what happens. And so he's out there in no man's land with his useless teenage friends, doing nothing of any good except living for the moment. And that's the nihilistic retreat from the corrupt state. And no wonder, and you might say, well, if the state is corrupt, why should I participate in its maintenance? Why should I do anything that's useful if all I'm doing is furthering the development of a corrupt state? And I would say the message in the most pathological university disciplines, the activist disciplines, that's exactly the message that they're particularly putting out to young men, which is, you live in a corrupt patriarchy. And that means any attempts that you make to further yourself in this life as an individual, with regards to your family, another corrupt patriarchal institution, with regards to marriage or career, all that is furthering the corrupt patriarchy. Everything you do that you think is good in the productive sense is actually doing nothing but contributing to this catastrophic tyrannical patriarchy. Very demoralizing, but also opens the door for you to be as useless as you possibly can, because, and there's always a temptation in that direction because it's easier, and you can justify it by saying, well, if I did anything productive, all I would be doing is furthering the dominance of the corrupt system anyways. And if you haven't met people who think that way, then you haven't met very many people, because that's an unbelievably common way of thinking. And it's an excuse, but it's also a logical reaction to the confusion of competence with power that's part and parcel of the collectivist landscape. So Simba grows up, so to speak, gets older at least, playing this impulsive day-to-day game. Rule 7 in my book is do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And of course Simba's lifestyle outside the rightful kingdom is nothing but expedience. It's impulsive pleasure. And that lasts until what? Until his old girlfriend shows up, Nella. And she's been dealing with the catastrophe of the state, and maybe that's because women, the demands of family fall heavier on women, at least initially. And so they're more sensitive to the catastrophe of the state. Nella shows up and says to Simba, what the hell do you think you're doing? You're useless. I liked you when you were a kid. Here you are, you're completely useless. And everything's falling apart, and the state has become corrupt, and there isn't enough to eat, and there's things that need to be done. And he falls in love with her, of course, probably because she criticizes him. And then he's deeply ashamed of himself because she rejects him, because he's useless. And so she should reject him because he's useless. And if she didn't, then he'd never figure out why he was useless and do something about it. And that's when he meets his father. Remember, there's an initiation scene there. The wise old baboon, who was supposed to be a fool in the early drafts of the movie, guides him down underground so that he can reflect upon himself, which is what he does in a pool down in the underworld. And what he sees reflected in his own face is the spirit of his dead father, mature face. Simba looks like this, right? He looks like a deer caught in the headlights. The animators have done a really good job of capturing that naive and sort of rotten old adolescent innocence, you know, that's outlived its utility. But his father has a very set face, which means he's integrated his aggression. And he sees his father in the water, and then he sees his father in the sky, and his father says, you've forgotten who you are. Wake the hell up. Grow the hell up. There are things to fix. There are things to fix. There's responsibilities to take on. And so Simba's rather shocked by this encounter and decides to leave his false adolescent paradise and to go back to the catastrophically demolished state. And he takes his friends and he sees this place where there's nothing but starvation and cruelty and malevolence and tyranny, and he fights a battle against evil and he reclaims his kingdom. And as soon as that happens, the rain falls and the plants grow and harmony is restored. And that's fascist mysticism, by the way. So it seems to appeal to a very large number of people, given the popularity of that movie. And what is that? Well, it's a call to responsibility. It's a fundamental call to responsibility, right? It is the case that we live in a field that's defined by the extent of our vision. It is the case that we live in a hierarchical structure on that plane. It is the case that there's a kingship at the top. It is the case that that's always threatened by malevolence and sin. It is the case that that can make you corrupt and cynical and irresponsible. It is the case that that's the inappropriate response, and that it's your responsibility to repair the damaged structure of tradition, despite the fact that it veers towards corruption. It is the case that if you take that responsibility on yourself, that the rain falls again and everything flourishes. It's correct. It's the right way of looking at the world. And if we didn't know that deeply, everyone in this room wouldn't have watched that movie.